Hey, it's Alan, and I just wanted to let you know that you can now listen to the ongoing history of new music early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Listen, before we start the show today, a quick note. Thanks to you, the ongoing history of new music podcast has been racing up the podcast charts, and we've been receiving a bunch of email and direct messages from fans of the show that you wanted to hear more episodes. Okay, done. We've heard you, and we're happy to do just that. So we're ramping things up around here. You will now get an additional ongoing history of new music podcast every week all summer long. So that's 2 shows for the price of, well, none. So get it. I mean, show is free. Okay, wait. Also enjoy this week's episode. Here we go. Religion has always had this love-hate thing with music. I mean, any religion I can think of uses music as part of ritual and prayer. It's been that way for millennia. But at the same time, only certain types of music are deemed to be acceptable. For example, a few years after the Nicene Council in the year 323, the young Christian church was faced with a new and hitherto corrupting force. It was a chord. Today we'd call it the augmented fourth, a type of musical interval known as the tritone. If you've taken music theory at some point, you'll know what I'm talking about. To the ears of the church, this chord sounded evil, something so hideous and awful that it sounded like something Satan himself might have composed. This, therefore, could only mean one thing. They reasoned that mortals who played this chord, or those who came under its spell, were obviously in league with the devil and required immediate burning at the stake. By the late 6th century, Pope Gregory had decreed that music be organized into a series of 8 modes, all of which, he said, met with God's approval. 1,000 years later, the Catholic Church helped encourage the transition to the major and minor system of keys and chords that we use today. And boy, we use them a lot, especially in ways that would freak out poor old Pope Gregory.
Mine eyes have seen the glory.
It's the new devotional music. It's one of the few segments of the music industry that's actually growing and becoming more profitable. And here's the weird thing, unless you're in the know, you'd never guess that these bands were all about God. Welcome to the world of today's Christian rock.
This is the ongoing history of new music podcast with Alan Cross.
We have to define our style if we're ever going to make a platinum album. I mean, I'm a fusion guy, but Kenny's background is more Latin jazz.
Yeah, and I'm more hip-hop and R&B oriented.
I think our band better buy a whole bunch of music CDs to listen to for inspiration.
Inspiration. Wait a minute. That's it. Inspiration, you guys. Don't you see?
See what?
Our band should play Christian rock.
Christian rock?
Think about it. It's the easiest, crappiest music in the world, right? If we just play songs about how much we love Jesus, all the Christians will buy our crap.
That's a retarded idea, Cartman.
It worked for Creed.
This time, I'm sorry. For this time, I'm sorry. This time I'm sorry. Will you love me?
P.O.D. with Will You from their 2003 album Payable on Death. If you've ever seen the video, you'll know that it was a real do unto others as you would have them do unto you vibe. And we'll come back to P.O.D. in just a couple of minutes. Welcome again, I'm Alan Cross, and the topic of this show was suggested by numerous emails from fans of the Christian alternative rock scene. They quite rightly point out that this is one area of popular music that's very big and getting bigger. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a number of bands cross over and become unexpected successes. Hello Creed, and P.O.D., and Collective Soul, and Evanescence, and Chevelle, and MXPX, and At the Drive-In. But because of the scene's religious connotations, it's considered to have built-in limited appeal. And there's another problem. Most of the mainstream music industry doesn't know what to do with these bands and their values. It's made billions by pushing songs about rebellion and sex and violence and infidelity and immorality and even criminal behavior. That kind of stuff they understand. This God business, well, that's just weird, man. But hold on. There's our first misconception, that these bands are preachy do-gooders who have milk and cookies at the top of their backstage riders. It's this bizarro world of rock, full of sweetness and light, right? Well, not necessarily. Until now, Christian rock has existed in its own parallel universe. But now, with an increasing number of bands crossing over, or at the very least getting a welcome boost from the music fans who populate this scene, it's time we sort of got under the hood of this whole Christian rock thing. If you're into the scene already, all this stuff will be familiar. But if you're a little fuzzy on this whole concept, I think you might be surprised at what you're about to hear.
Hey, there was a bass guitar in my basement.
I told you, Token.
So what are we doing?
Gentlemen, we're about to embark on the most amazing, life-affirming, financially wind-falling experiences of our young lives.
Wow!
We are going to start a Christian rock band.
I'm out.
Wait! Walk out that door, Token, and you'll regret it the rest of your life. Christians have a built-in audience of over 180 million Americans. If each one of them bought just one of our albums at $12.95, that would be...
$2,331,000,000.
Still want to leave, Token?
With arms wide open, under the sunlight. Welcome to this place. I'll show you everything. With arms wide open, now everything.
Let's begin with a fast history. Like I said earlier, popular music and religion have often gone head-to-head. When rock and roll first came on the scene in the 1950s, leaders of all denominations and creeds declared it to be the music of the devil. Rock and roll was condemned from pulpits everywhere as immoral and evil. Some churches went so far as to hold public record burnings. Elvis and the Beatles were two prime targets. Race music, which is what they called rhythm and blues made by black performers back then, also took a lot of the heat for being heathen. Seriously, something about having unnatural carnal rhythms. That's what they said, unnatural carnal rhythms. And there were those who still feel this way. There was no such thing as Christian rock for decades. The concept was oxymoronic. Good Christians simply did not rock. Electric guitars had no place in hymns. And even when a few people decided that rocking out wasn't bad for the soul, they had to keep it kind of quiet. It took an Orange County band called Stryper to break through into mainstream consciousness. By the way, Stryper stands for Salvation Through Redemption Yielding Peace, Encouragement, and Righteousness, which is about as strained an acronym as you're ever going to find. Stryper sounded a lot like a cross between Van Halen and Def Leppard, and despite their wholesome message, they attracted the attention of metalheads. They all dressed in bumblebee spandex and fired Bibles into the crowd using specially designed cannons. But the most popular Christian band of the early 1980s was Irish. Maybe you've heard of them. U2 with Gloria from 1981. Note how Bono sings part of the song in Latin from the Catholic Mass. And frankly, he did that because before the band went into the studio to record this album, somebody stole Bono's book of lyrics. He had to ad-lib a lot of the words on the October album. And like a good Irish Catholic boy, he started repeating what he heard in church all those years. People forget that U2 was portrayed as a Christian band in their early years. Their religious values was a big part of their image back then, and they were very public about it. When they were still teenagers, 3/4 of the band, Adam Clayton being the sole heathen, were involved in an evangelical, non-denominational Christian movement called Shalom. Shalom eventually became dominated by the hardcore element, who started asking hard questions like, how can you be in a rock band and Christian at the same time, my brothers? This created a philosophical and spiritual conundrum within U2, and the band nearly broke up over it. Fortunately, they were able to reconcile their need to rock with their desire to preserve their immortal souls. And they continued on. Christian rock continued to grow and toughen up throughout the 1980s, but for most people, Christian rock was still stereotyped as well-scrubbed preaching from behind a guitar. Mainstream fans found the music weak and watered down. And wasn't rock and roll supposed to be about rebellion? Didn't religion kind of negate the whole rock experience? Yeah, well, but all that was about to change thanks to several groups who managed to sneak into the mainstream. Some managed to even infiltrate Ozzy Osbourne's world. By the late 1990s, Christian rock had really opened up. More groups were formed. The guitars got louder and the beats got heavier. There was even a Christian speed and thrash scene that started up in California. Throughout the decade, a large and sophisticated infrastructure designed to foster, promote, and distribute this music was put in place. Christian bands played in Christian-owned clubs and signed to Christian-owned record labels who sold their CDs through Christian bookstores. Some called it the Christian Underground. By the end of the decade, the various stereotypes began to fall by the wayside. Instead of weak and safe imitations of the real thing, these bands began to attract fans for their sound and not their message. The music was positive and current while being less preachy. They looked and sounded and were packaged a lot like mainstream bands, but there was a definite lack of sex and drugs in this rock and roll.
But if I can't swim after 40 days and my mind is crushed by the crashing waves that be up so high that I cannot fall, lift me up, lift me up when I'm falling.
A hit from Jars of Clay from 1996 called Flood. They were the big breakout band from what's known as the alternative CCM movement. CCM stands for Contemporary Christian Music, by the way. Jars of Clay paved the way for modest mainstream success by a band called DC Talk, and then there was Sixpence None the Richer, who also had some big singles. The market for Christian rock grew quickly in the middle 90s. Youth groups and churches began to put on shows, which is about the safest type of concert any parent could hope to find. And that's how word on a lot of these bands began to spread. Now let's go back to POD for a second. Don't let all the tattoos and long hair fool you. All the members of the band are born again. Their manager used to run a Christian rock club in San Diego. When they started up in 1992, POD began by playing all the youth group concerts at churches and community centers in their area and then across the country. And in the process, they managed to sell 40,000 copies of their 3 self-released indie EPs, which certainly wasn't bad. Because they were simply positive and not preachy with their lyrics, and because they really rocked, POD managed to attract a substantial number of mainstream rock fans. By the end of the 1990s, they were winning all kinds of local music awards. And by the summer of 2000, this band of born-agains was on the road with the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne, and that year's version of Ozfest. Talk about sabotaging Satan's music from the inside. Eventually, and thanks to the network of fans POD had amassed in the Christian-friendly clubs across the U.S., they were discovered and signed by Atlantic Records. POD became one of the first major crossovers from the Christian underground into the mainstream world of heathen rock.
I feel so alive for the very first time. I can't deny you. I feel so alive. I feel so alive.
Alive from POD and their 2001 breakthrough album, Satellite. A record all about living and striving instead of death and dying and the awful things that come with life. And here's some irony. That record was released on September 11th, 2001. Then again, maybe the attacks on New York and Washington helped POD become even more popular. A lot of people flocked to this record because it was positive. And at the time, we were all looking for something, anything positive. But here's the thing. People got into POD without even knowing the group's Christian roots. All they cared about was that this was a great rock band that made great music. In fact, it's possible that you just heard for the first time that POD was a Christian rock band. The biggest crossover from the Christian world in the late 90s was Creed. Although they never professed to be a Christian band in the traditional sense, Creed certainly was grounded in Christian values, something that was much appreciated at home in northwestern Florida. The guitars were fat and tuned low, and the songs were filled with spiritual images and themes. There was no swearing. They looked like nice, safe church-going boys, and with a name like Creed, well, that just sounded so wholesome, didn't it?
What's this life for? What's this life for? What's this life for?
Creed, from their first album, 1998's My Own Prison. The first place that record started selling? Christian record stores. And once Creed broke through and started selling records in the millions, there was much talk and much debate on the nature of the band's spirituality. Some were supportive, while others didn't buy it. Whatever. The bottom line is that Creed got to where they are today with the help of the so-called Christian underground. Speaking of which, here's Evanescence. They were another group that springboarded to mainstream success with the help of the Christian rock community. They were formed when members of the band met at a youth camp in Arkansas. When they signed to a record deal, their CDs were sold through Christian record stores, which is not surprising considering that their record company was Wind Up, the same label that launched Creed's career in the same way. Evanescence sold a ton of records through those Christian stores and in the process solidified a fan base. The spiritual lyrics and occasional mentions of God were appreciated, and whether they intended this to happen or not, Evanescence became classified as a Christian rock band. But then Evanescence found themselves being drawn into the secular world thanks to the song Bring Me to Life. It ended up on the soundtrack of the movie Daredevil and then took on a life of its own. The Fallen album went on to sell in the millions. But then there was the big fall from grace. When Rolling Stone published an interview featuring much swearing, the backlash from the Christian rock community was substantial and very, very loud. Wind Up Records was forced to pull all Evanescence records out of all Christian stores.
Wake me up inside. Can't wake up. Wake me up inside. Call my name and save me from the dark. Wake me up. Bid my blood to run. Can't wake up before I come undone. Save me from the nothing I've been.
Evanescence from their 2003 breakthrough Fallen. They may not be considered to be part of the Christian rock world now, but that's where they started. When we come back, we'll look at a few more bands who are definitely from the Christian side of the tracks, and you may be surprised at what you hear.
Hi, this is Alan Cross. Welcome to the Ongoing History of New Music podcast, our weekly exploration of the stories and characters that made modern music what it is today. We want to make this podcast one of your favorites. So if you love the show, do me a favor, tell a friend about it. Or rate it on iTunes if that's your thing. We'd really love it if you do that. Or you can just drop me an email with your thoughts to alan@alancross.ca. Maybe you want more information on something you hear. Or maybe you have an idea for a topic for a future episode. Whatever. I guarantee your response. alan@alancross.ca. Whether you're listening one at a time or binging on a bunch of podcasts all at once, we're glad to have you here. All right, let's talk music, shall we?
Another Christian-themed band that got started in the 1990s was MXPX, a punk band from Bremerton, Washington. They were formed in 1993, and by the time the guys got out of high school, they had already released a series of 7-inch singles for a label called Tooth and Nail. Now, Tooth and Nail is a Christian-owned, Seattle-based record label that specializes in contemporary-sounding Christian rock. The company was founded in 1993 by a guy named Brandon Ebel, when he noticed that there were a number of very good, punky and grungy indie bands in the Pacific Northwest that couldn't get signed to a mainstream label because of their religious connotations. At the same time, the Christian record companies wouldn't touch these bands because their sound was just too heavy. Tooth and Nail allowed the bands to make the music they wanted with no attempt to either A, convert non-believers, or B, please frightened parents. Although the band has since been signed to a major label and has moved on to touring with the Warped Tour and can be seen in a Pepsi commercial, MXPX was one of Tooth and Nail's first big victories. Here's something from one of those early albums back in 1996. The record was Life in General, and this is Chick Magnet.
Chick magnet. Chick magnet. Chick magnet. Chick magnet. Chick magnet. Chick magnet. Chick magnet.
The Christian punk band MXPX with Chick Magnet. They recorded that when they were part of the Tooth and Nail label in Seattle. These days, when Tooth and Nail signs a band, the major labels watch very, very closely. Hey, anytime a band they've never heard of can attract 1,000 people to a show, they're going to pay attention. Here are some Tooth and Nail bands that are creating some excitement right now. POD once recorded for them. Then there's Juliana Theory, Zao, Starflyer 59, Further Seems Forever, and May. And let me play you something. This is a group from the Tooth and Nail stable called Anne Berlin. They're originally from Orlando and morphed out of a Christian punk band called Sago, which was short for Servants After God's Own Heart. Anne Berlin sounds like, like this. This is called Embrace the Dead.
Chorus demons, helpless you cry each night you pray that tomorrow you won't die. You're living, barely breathing.
That ain't grandma's religious music. Orlando's Anne Berlin with Embrace the Dead. And by the way, the singer's name is Stephen Christian. Really. So things are all rosy in the world of Christian rock. Everybody loves one another, and the scene is growing more popular and more profitable. It's just perfect. Not really. There are a series of schisms within the Christian underground. Some of the bands we've heard on this program are worried about alienating their Christian fans as they cross over into the mainstream. They know they can't be too negative or enter territory that might be interpreted as immoral, offensive, and anti-God. Some factions of Christian rock fans can be very judgmental. Without the requisite number of GPMs, that means the number of times the word God is invoked every minute in the lyrics, GPMs, gods per minute, then the band is no more holy than Motley Crue. At the same time, these bands are worried about being too wholesome for the rest of the world, that they'll be perceived as sermonizers and proselytizers, and if that happens, they'll be shot down based on preconceived notions. But then again, let's look back at Creed and POD and Evanescence and all the other groups that we've talked about. Did the majority of people buy their records because they came from the Christian scene, or because they wrote great songs? I suspect that that's the real reason. Over the course of the last hour, you may have come to the conclusion that things have never been better in the world of Christian rock. Not really. Remember those schisms I mentioned? The concept that rock music is evil is still alive and well. Some people believe that these bands, no matter what their veneer, are perverting Christianity. And they're pretty adamant about that. And they spend lots of time quoting scripture to support their opinions on the evils and perversions of Creed and Jars of Clay and MXPX and everybody else. In fact, they have found ways to condemn Amy Grant as evil. If you're into the CCM movement, none of what you've heard on this show is new. But the fact that you've heard it on a show like this gives you an idea of how this music is seeping into the mainstream. It's interesting, isn't it? Technical production is by the saintly Rob Johnston. Bless you, my son. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to the Ongoing History of New Music podcast with Alan Cross. Subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and everywhere you find your favorite podcasts.